Buenas tardes a esta
Good afternoon, and welcome to this last session of this fourth series of Ecotopias in La Casa Encendida. Today we have a very special session. It's a very special session for us because we have Stanley Robinson with us here today, who's one of the science fiction writers that is best known in the world. He's one of the most important science fiction writers, and because of his style, he has a very special connection to this cycle. And actually, during the first series, we thought that sustainability was something that could be considered as alien, and that's when we started thinking about his novels and his work. And he's one of the most important writers because he is recovering that political reimagination, trying to face that monoculture, that dystopia we're locked up in. Has been called Jules Verne of the 21st century. He is also a mix of Alexander Bogdanov, that Soviet writer who wrote Red Star, who was a member of the Russian Communist Party. So actually, there is a relationship between politics and science fiction, and it's a close relationship, even more than we might have imagined. And actually, Kim is one of those writers who looks into the future, trying to think about how we could actually benefit from some technological advances by giving more social protagonism to society as well, and understanding that the dynamics of societies or imagining better societies is not about eluding the conflict and the plurality of different social organization ways and eco-social narratives that are not just unidimensional. So we just wanted to thank him for his presence here today. The session is going to last around an hour, and the first 40 minutes will be dedicated to Kim's words. He will be sharing an introduction and some ideas about the tensions between the dystopian context and why recovering this re-updated utopian discourse. And then we will have around 20 minutes for your questions. And you can start sending your questions via chat, and I will try to organize them a bit, and we will then be asking those questions to Kim. So without stealing more of his time, I just wanted to thank him once again for the privilege he has granted us by sharing part of his afternoon with us.
Well, thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm going to try to tailor my remarks to the Spanish situation, at least at the end of my talk. So we'll see where that goes, since I'm fundamentally ignorant of the situation. But there are ways in which Spain is a great illustration of where we are now and what possibilities exist. So first, I want to talk a bit about the speed of change. And it's famous in English language social sciences that since World War II, we've had what could be called the Great Acceleration. This is their name for the acceleration of practically everything that we measure. So human population, the amount of stress put on the biosphere, the production of food through the Green Revolution, and in short, across the board, since World War II, human civilization has speeded up, and you can see it on a graph, of course, with the great hockey stick tilts upward. And I want to suggest that there are accelerations within the acceleration that have to do with confluences of technological and sociological events, and that we are now in an acceleration that is quite startling and felt by everybody. I would say that we've gotten used to the speed of change, so that in America, there was a book in 1970 called Future Shock about the feeling of this speeding up, and then nobody felt future shock anymore because we were used to the speed of change. But now there's been another acceleration, and I would point to the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the recent developments in so-called artificial intelligence, and then also the obvious appearances in the physical world of climate change, that all of these have combined in a way that means that I wrote my novel, The Ministry for the Future, in 2019, and now 4 years later, it is already a historical artifact of that period when I wrote it. And it seems almost like the other side of a geological divide. And many sentences in my novel are now wrong, particularly when they speak about the speed of change, so that in my novel, there would be some such sentence that, for instance, the 2030s were zombie years. Well, that's not going to happen. That is now impossible. It was a feeling of 2019, of being in the Trump administration, of being pre-pandemic, in a sense that nobody was reacting fast enough to the emergency that we call climate change, sometimes now called the polycrisis, which I think is a useful term in English anyway. And we are in a different world now than even in 2019. So one of the aspects of that is a structure of feeling. This is from Raymond Williams, the English leftist Marxist literary critic. Structure of feeling has changed since 2019, and I'm thinking that now I sense in my visits all over the world a feeling of climate dread, of things speeding up out of our ability to deal with them. And it maybe is worth, well, this is particularly strange thing to say to a Spanish audience, but the 1930s, this feeling that the world was sliding into war, well, Spain was a precursor to that war. So it was elsewhere watching that, the Spanish Civil War, and the feeling of Germany's rise to power again, that we were inevitably sliding toward disaster that came in at the end of the 1930s. This historical analogy is suggestive, but it's not right for our moment. We're all in the same boat together in a planetary sense. There are national conflicts between sovereign nation states, as is obvious with Russia invading Ukraine, but this is regarded as a criminal action that can be contained. And in short, the Paris Agreement has made every nation state in the world a member state. And I want to talk about member states as a way to structure the rest of this talk. But before I get to that, I want to finish with speeds of change. In ecology, where they're studying the network of living creatures that occupy a watershed or a region, they have calculations of the speed of change that I think are interesting to put to use for us. And if change happens too fast, then it's simply a disaster, and the living creatures have no opportunity to change their habits, to adjust, to adapt to the new situation. If a meteor strikes, if a war from the next country hits you, then it's a catastrophe that doesn't give you time to react and change. You simply have to survive that moment day to day. So that's speed that's too fast. Then on the other end of the scale, and here I would again speak to before 2019, when talking in particular about the climate crisis, the change would be discussed as if it were happening in hundreds of years, even when it comes to sea level rise, in terms of thousands of years. So the change was essentially too slow for human perceptions or human political arrangements to come to grips with, and it was simply ignored as something that was too slow to inspire action. And I feel we were there before the pandemic struck us. Now, because of this acceleration within the acceleration that I spoke of earlier, we might be in the Goldilocks zone, which is to say the right speed of change for us to take action. In 2009, Johan Rockström of Sweden, who runs the Potsdam Institute in Germany, published a very famous paper in Nature outlining planetary boundaries, which is to say aspects of the biosphere that we cannot change without endangering the biosphere itself. He and his co-authors identified 9 kinds of planetary boundaries. One of them, yes, carbon dioxide, another one, nitrogen cycle, another one, the kind of the beginning of the mass extinction event that we've already started by human actions, the 6th great mass extinction event. These planetary boundaries come together, and we cannot break them without getting into a situation where even if all humanity decided to cope, to claw back from the accelerating degradation of the biosphere itself, we would not be able to. We only have a limited amount of power over the biophysical systems of the Earth itself. And all discussion of humanity changing the Earth's biosystems are talking about moments where we can, with our limited powers, tweak larger processes in a way that will make them go in a direction that we want. That can quickly, because of positive feedback loops, things that get past the planetary boundaries, processes can accelerate also in their own destructive ways. And one of the most obvious is that if there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, then that will heat up the Earth, and that will release a lot more frozen CO2 and methane out of the permafrost in the Arctic in ways that would make it a hothouse Earth, a runaway greenhouse effect that humanity would not be able to stop. So these planetary boundaries are not negotiable. They're not like the usual trade-offs and compromises made by humanity amongst ourselves and amongst our nation states. They aren't political. They can be politicized, perhaps. They become politics, but they are not negotiable. They are true planetary limits. Now, the implications of that have been sinking in. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed, where all the nations on Earth agreed to fight climate change in a very important international treaty that still looms large with the meetings every November 1st. We just finished COP27, but it was only, I believe, COP15 where the Paris Agreement was signed, and has driven the process ever since. Now, last year in Montreal, in a meeting that was run by the Chinese, and they should have been hosting it in China, but problems with COVID first put that meeting off for a year, and then moved it to Montreal, where the Canadians and Chinese hosted it together. At that biological COP meeting, there was an agreement that 30% of the surface of the Earth should be saved for wild creatures, and humanity would, for the most part, leave those areas alone and let wild nature repair itself by living. Life is robust. Life is proliferates very well. Life wants to live and struggles to live. And if we leave alone the wild world, it will quickly adapt to the circumstances it's in and dodge the mass extinction event. So this was huge, and China pushed it. They twisted the arms of their African client states to get them to agree, because all of these COP systems are run by consensus, which is peculiar and unusual in human political affairs, that everybody has to sign on to every statement made by the group is a huge constraint. It slows everything down. It makes it conservative and cautious. On the other hand, there's an immense power to it because everybody has indeed agreed in the end. So although it is frustrating to have to reach consensus, and the whole process is going slower than it needs to go, it's nevertheless a powerful process. And that moment in Montreal last year was crucial news, underreported because humans focus on themselves, or they focus on more trivial or more local concerns. Who knows? We're all aware that the internet is filled with junk and argument. But that news was crucial for us surviving the climate crisis, and which is indeed also a biosphere crisis. So the other thing that happened just this year, perhaps back in February, an almost identical treaty that had taken 10 years, and it's not part of the Paris Agreement or even the Congress of the Parties. It has to do with the oceans. And here again, there was an agreement signed on to by all the nations that are part of this group. And I think that means almost all the nations on Earth, that the oceans also should have 30% of their area left alone. No fishing fleets is the main consideration. And Spain has not been good when it comes to authorizing fishing fleets to take more fish than they ought to in waters like the Antarctic, where they ought not to be there at all. But they signed on to this agreement, and so did every other nation. And 30% of the oceans is a vast region of water where ocean life will be able to recover from human overfishing. Now, the chemistry will still be influenced by human actions, the pH of the ocean and other factors, pollution, that mean that leaving 30% of it alone is not a total cure, but it is a big help. And it is another piece of important news that the message has gotten through to the scientific world. That means also the diplomatic world, the technocratic world, the people who are working for the nation states to exercise state power have become aware that these planetary boundaries are non-negotiable, they're dangerous, they present an existential danger that has to be acted on. And so we are seeing things that in 2019, I would have regarded as utopian science fiction and impossible to write down as if they were really going to happen. And here, 4 years later, they have already happened. This is good news and surprising, and it calls out for an explanation that I can't quite provide for you, but I think it's this sensation generally that the scientists have managed to convey that the planetary boundaries are real, they're non-negotiable, we are breaking them, we are in the process of breaking them, and that if we do, civilization itself might crash. And then it's a war of all against all. So this is an existential danger, not of extinction, not for humans, but of civilizational breakdown, which is in many ways almost as bad or worse. So now I want to speak briefly to the finances of this situation. So say we know our danger, say we know what to do, we nevertheless live in a global economic system that doesn't care about that, that rewards bad actions, so that we have metrics like profit, which may be at this point translated into a measurement of how much damage has been done to people, to their lives, as the precariat, as workers in a world of capitalist power, and then also the biosphere being torn up for short-term gains that will create long-term damage. Profit for every company, and even for nation states looking at their own gross domestic product, they are measurements at this point of damage done for the sake of a few people's short-term accumulation of value that won't last in a general crash. So profit is a bad measurement. Shareholder value, which is the capitalist investment in various companies and their efforts. Shareholder value is another measurement of damage done, of short-term gains taken at the cost of long-term losses. So we are in a bad economic system for dealing with the great emergency of climate change, because it doesn't understand, the economic system does not understand the nature of the danger and has not costed it, has not put a price on it, so that human actions are being paid for. People make their living and people make profits and increase their capital. These are different people, by damaging the biosphere rather than repairing it. So the financial situation is very poor. And what I want to report on is signs that it's getting better, that along with the general awareness of the crisis, there is a general awareness that the crisis is caused by capitalist economics miscalculating what humans should be doing in a destructive way. So in 2008, when there was a worldwide recession, quantitative easing came into play, and the European Union and the United States and China, all countries, created at the central bank level something like 5 to 10 trillion US dollars to keep liquidity in the economy, to keep people working, to avoid a depression. New fiat money was created. So here I'm not talking about cryptocurrencies. These are symbolized by Bitcoin. They are Ponzi schemes, they're scams, they are not real. They're not money in the sense that money is properly defined, a medium of exchange, a storage of value, and a sign of social trust. Bitcoin fails, cryptocurrency fails all three definitions. So what I'm talking about is fiat money made by the central banks, by nation states themselves. And to be blunt, the richer the nation is, the more it can make up new money without harming people's sense that that money is real. So the US dollar for sure, the euro, and the Chinese renminbi are the currencies that the governments can decide to create more of those monies, and it doesn't harm people's trust in that money. When the COVID pandemic hit, another $20 trillion were created from nothing by central banks to avoid an instant depression caused by everybody having to stay home to suppress the pandemic. Both of these moments of quantitative easing did not destroy people's faith in money. And the recent surge in inflation is not because of those quantitative easings. It's because of Russia's war on Ukraine causing a shortage of fuel, fossil fuels, and of food. And of course, when there's a shortage of things people want, the prices increase. So there is no judgment to be made against quantitative easing. It can be done again. It almost certainly will be done again. Indeed, the current banking crisis in Switzerland and in the Silicon Valley, that is being contained by improvisations at the financial level that involve the creation of new money to cover sudden shortages caused by bad gambling, you might say. So we are in a new financial world where the central banks themselves have formed an organization called the Network for Greening the Financial System. You can look it up online. They have published a white paper talking about greening money at the source. So it's like the carbon coin in my novel Ministry for the Future, but much more elaborated. And the upshot of it might be similar to my novel. If you draw carbon down out of the atmosphere, you get paid for it. If you burn carbon into the atmosphere, you get taxed for it. And by making this rather simple to understand financial adjustment, we can begin to pay ourselves to do the necessary work to dodge the mass extinction event. So in the United States and also the recent Biden administration climate bill called the Inflation Reduction Act for political purposes, it really was a climate bill. It was the biggest ever signed, and it also began to reintroduce industrial policy into national politics. This is a good sign of neoliberal capitalists' free trade, where capital ruled the world and the nation states were simply servants of private capital. There's now a swing towards national control of the economies, and they will be coordinated with other nations by way of the Paris Agreement and other international agreements to begin to take over the economy, take it away from private capital, and force it by law and also by the creation of new money into green activities. So we can see this happening. We can see the European Union in response to the US bill. The European Union has had to respond itself with more expenditures in euros for good climate work. And we're coming into a situation where, although there will be massive resistance to it from vested interests, from certain misguided sources of private capital, and from the petrostates and from the fossil fuel industries, all those forces will resist this movement, but there's a larger sense of the existential dangers such that the movement will prevail, I think. I'm seeing the momentum everywhere I look for solving the climate problem by way of the nation states working together. Now, I want to draw my remarks to a close with a final speculation, let's say, about the situation of Spain, and about which I have to say immediately at first that I am pretty ignorant, but it's a big part of world history, Spain. It's a big part of the EU and of the Mediterranean. And since I come from California, have my own Sierra Nevada, I know a little bit about it, and just in the way that one knows the international situation. So, first of all, it's a member state of the European Union, very important, because that means that it's part of a larger political organization of immense importance. So every member state in the European Union has an influence at the level of the macro state of the European Union, but also being a member state has a different psychological, emotional, legal, and financial implications in that some sovereignty has been given over to the larger organization, and willingly, by agreement, in order to gain power at the local level. I want to suggest that that also works downward, that Spain itself is a kind of federation because of its historical background, so that you have the Catalonia, you have the Basque region, you have Andalusia and the Galicia. These regions, these were states themselves that gathered together. One can even include, I suppose, Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula is a geographical unit that in the course of its earlier history had strong regional governments. And indeed, I'm very often in my science fiction, some of you will know this, have referenced Mondragon in the Basque region as being a model for what you sometimes might call a Catholic capitalism. Or in South America, they have liberation theology, which is to say a kind of Catholic church religious insistence on political equality for all. And so I'm wondering if Mondragon's liberation theology come out of Spain itself. Father Jose Maria Zendiarata, that's not how you pronounce it, but it's got too many syllables. This young man, in his transformation of Mondragon, was doing liberation theology in Spain itself under Franco. Well, it's a model of intelligent adjustment to a world situation that you can't control, but you can manipulate it at the local level. And I think it's a lesson for the rest of Spain. I'd also want to remember the memory of the convivencia, or the convivencia. I don't know how to pronounce that either, but you know the period of time I mean in the Middle Ages. And now the emptying out of the highlands of Spain, the opportunities for rewilding, this 30 by 30, leaving 30% of the land empty for the other creatures. By the year 2030, Spain could achieve that program quite easily. We're doing it in California. We're at 24%. By 2030, we'll be at 30%. Many people talk about 50 by 50, that by the year 2050, we'll leave half of the land surface to the animals for our own good. These are projects that I think Spain can be interested in. And being part of the European Union, there's going to be a lot of EU money to be provided for carbon drawdown projects, for decarbonization of all kinds. And I'm wondering if the Mediterranean basin ought to be a ring of nations, Southern Europe, Northern Africa, Malta, the Balearics, that the Mediterranean is a crucial geo-region that is, it doesn't seem to me that it is unified by any larger political organization like the EU, that there might be opportunities there for thinking about. And then there's between the Paris Agreement and places like the fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty, where they're trying to, there's an effort to get nation states to sign on to promise to not proliferate their fossil fuels in exchange for compensation from the United Central Banks of the world to be able to pay for decarbonizing work, to get ourselves away from burning carbon as fast as possible. This is something that also that I think Spain could be part of, given the big countryside, the wonderful climate, the opportunities, the need for work, the opportunities for a full employment program that could come out of the state support for decarbonizing efforts. So it seems to me that there are local opportunities within Spain and the larger federation that Spain represents at smaller units than that for becoming an exemplary state. I'm thinking now of California within the United States. It's not quite the same as Spain within the EU, but the truth is that California is leading by example and by local law in ways that are suggestive as what can be done in this larger, essentially international and global effort. What can the smaller political units do? Well, they can lead by example and try to connect up with the others. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Koisa and the rest of you, and be available to answer questions here. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much, Kim, for this inspiring intervention, really. And after listening to your words, I'm going to actually continue with a couple of things that you have said. It was actually very suggestive because you were self-criticizing your book. Now that time has gone by, you have actually said how your book has aged, how the Ministry for the Future has aged with time. And if you were to rewrite it now, you would obviously have to change certain fictions. And pulling from that thread, that reflection, I also saw that in your last books, at least those that had clearer dates, or that we go from New York to the Ministry for the Future, which is that is closer to us. I mean, you are going from further in the future to a closer date in history, and we see the different realities trying to adjust or to modulate somehow that distancing or that necessary alienation that science fiction makes so attractive, that makes so compelling, so that we can think about our present really by thinking about the future.
Yes, thank you for that. It's very true. My fellow science fiction writer, Cory Doctorow, compared my recent set of novels to a ranging exercise with mortar, with cannons and mortar fire, as in Ukraine. It's an ugly analogy now. He made it earlier, that each shot ranges closer to the present. From my novel 2312 until now, each novel has gotten closer to the present, and now I'm just writing about climate change is no longer in the future, but something that we're in already. So to do proper science fiction now, we're in a science fiction novel. We're writing it all together. The future has crashed in on the present and is over-determining the present. What we do now will determine what humans later can do in really important ways. So I guess you could still write a book set 100 years or 500 years from now, but it would be so much of a speculation because it could be anything from a horrible catastrophe to a quite prosperous utopian, almost golden age, depending on what we do right now. So maybe the most interesting stories are suddenly, even the most interesting science fiction stories are suddenly now.
Bueno, mientras ya han llegado alguna pregunta.
Well, it seems that some questions have been written on the chat, but while others are written, I would like to ask you another question, because you have talked about the need of including other criteria when crunching numbers and assessing the situation. We need other indicators, not just the monetary or economical indicators, which were the only ones that were being used in this. So we need to somehow make our system more environmentally friendly or conscious, and we need another way of saying things. And I'm going to link that to that idea. In the political sphere, there is a greater penetration of our thoughts of the future. And actually in Switzerland, they do have a ministry for the future, because they have to think about certain things that have to be out of the polarized debate. They have to have that long-term perspective. And Macron had the Red Group that was advising the government with regards to national safety, and some science fiction authors have also collaborated in, for instance, in the UK as well. They have the ombudsman of the new generation. So we are institutionalizing this perspective, thinking about the future, and it's something that is operating in the present. It's politically operating in the present. So that's one of the things that your words made me think of. And the next has to do with that example you gave of what is being done in California and could be done in Spain, and the importance of exemplary action. You were saying about Mondragon as well, which is always is very much present in many novels, and I think it is an element that you were saying, this Catholic roots and this cooperative dimension as well, how it could be used as a mirror where all the social economy projects should look at themselves, so that we can be inspired by that, or so that we can criticize the Mondragon model. But it's undeniable that it is a way of building society, and it's quite inspiring. And I wanted to take this, I don't know if you know, in Spain, the role of the municipalities movement. It is something that has been going on in the last few years, especially in Barcelona. So this movement, this transformation movement that comes from the municipalities, and the role that different cities are having in this process of building real utopias. So as it's the right thought of Mondragon. And the next question, or the last question that I have for you, and then I'll give the floor to the audience, is the utopian thought historically has always used narratives to inspire actions, and it was trying to reproduce in the real world things that had been considered in books, and in many cases they were fictions, and in other cases they weren't. So I believe that we're in a time where we have actions that could be seeds planted for utopia, but we are missing a wider array of narratives, of stories. Do you think that we are lacking stories, or do you think that we need to create new utopias that can be adapted to our present reality?
Yes, I absolutely think there needs to be more utopias. Now, having said that, this is sort of like a carpenter saying you need more nails. You need, in other words, I've been a utopian science fiction writer all my life, and I've felt lonely, or I had my great teacher, Ursula K. Le Guin. I had my great friend Ian Banks. And there are people like Cory Doctorow writing stories of people putting together solutions. So this isn't so much utopian in the old sense of a total system that would work better. Those are both easy and also hypothetical because we're caught in the moment and the history that we're in. So utopian science fiction for me has become a kind of description of best case scenarios. In other words, now, given where we are, a moment of high danger and quite bad global systems, I have to say, residuals of old power relations, a kind of liquidified feudalism, we are in trouble. And so a best case scenario might be just us dodging the mass extinction event here, as in my ministry, and then that's utopia. That's our utopia, not the perfect society, but simply figuring out how to cope with the next 30 years. Well, we need much more of that. And I'm seeing it. There are younger writers, they call it hope punk or solar punk. They have names for it where they're dodging their political responsibilities. They don't want to say outright, I write utopian fiction, because that marginalizes them commercially and politically. And utopias are notorious for being boring. And so as a young writer, you're treading onto dangerous ground. So climate fiction, let's say that climate fiction is a name for science fiction of our time that is dealing with the real world, that kind of science fiction. And it's also got a utopian strand in it. Occasionally there are climate fiction stories where everything just falls apart. Dystopia. But those are like zombie stories. They've been taken over by horror fiction. The science fiction that is called climate fiction is going to grow, and it is a good thing. It's a people struggling to write stories of us dealing successfully with the problem. So that's what utopia has become in our time. And when you see this new genre of climate fiction, you can maybe translate it and think to yourself, this is what utopia has come to in our time. It's called climate fiction.
Muy interesante.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to read one of the first questions that have been sent to us via chat. They're saying that in your intervention, you have not referred to the role of activism, and they're asking how you see eco-activism. Do you think that it is a key actor? And where do you see things happening, or how do you see the processes of radicalization of some young ecology movements? And I'm thinking of rebellion and movements that are also challenging the system, that ask for civil disobedience and so on.
Yes. Thank you for that excellent question. It's very important. When the moment comes where ordinary citizens fill the streets, we're seeing it in France right now because of the change of retirement age. We're seeing it in Israel right now because of the attempt to change the law for Supreme Court. That has effects in the world. The whole world sees it. This is a phrase from the 1960s. The whole world is watching. If that can happen for climate change, which I must say is difficult, but it might happen, then the nation states' sources of power, private capital, they will all begin to change faster than they are. So mass demonstrations are crucially important, but getting people to do it is usually a matter of their immediate interest for themselves and their families. In Israel, that's not quite true. They are showing up in the streets for a principle of government. And I'm wondering if demonstrations could be framed as protesting on behalf of the children in ways that the children can't yet do, that there might be more of that. Then also the question refers to or leads to civil disobedience to the point of possible, as the Swedish philosopher Andreas Malm put it, how to blow up a pipeline, sabotage. And one thing, another critique I would immediately make of my ministry for the future is it does not make a good distinction between sabotage and murder. And those are very different ethical actions. And one could assert that destruction of property, of things, is not violence, that violence is hurting humans, hurting property, or let's put it this way, damaging property is maybe ethically justified if that property is going to wreck people's lives in the next decade, in the next century, and for the next 1,000 years. It might be justifiable. And this is one aspect of civil disobedience that Andreas Malm is very good at bringing up. But no one person, no one philosopher, leader, or thinker can come to any decisive conclusions here. This is a civilizational question. Groups have to think, individuals have to talk with each other about what's right to do. And it would be best if legal actions would do it. And so that's where the mass demonstrations, people in the streets, general strikes, targeted strikes, all of these are, I think, better instruments for change than breaking laws. But the crisis may push people to things that might not even be very effective out of a sense of desperation, out of a sense of anger. So the first step, I think, would be to organize group actions that show the policymakers and show private capital so that young people gluing themselves to the doors of a bank or a hedge fund or an investment bank to protest the continuing investment in fossil fuels, which is an almost suicidal move, but apparently is inevitable in certain short-term calculations. That, in other words, targeted demonstrations. You don't just inconvenience the general population. In England, Extinction Rebellion, lying down across the highways and blocking people from getting to work on time. All that created was an immense irritation at the arrogance of the people doing the protesting. But gluing yourselves to the glass doors of a bank and forcing the people who work in that bank to think about what they're doing, this might be more effective. And I guess I'll end this by saying that I don't feel like we've had a proper discussion of the rhetoric of actions. In other words, which actions have which effects and which are preferable. We have a great rhetoric for language. We don't have good rhetoric for action. And amazing things have happened in Spain, in Spanish history, and in European history, to the point where the discussion there would be much more sophisticated than it would be in a younger and less sophisticated country like the United States. So it's maybe something worth talking about with your groups there, a fuller discussion of what can we do that will push the process faster than the COP system will. That would be a really useful intervention.
Pues Kim, sabíamos que...
Well, Kim, we knew that you didn't have much time. Could I maybe ask you one last question? Would you?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to try and combine two questions, and if there are other questions, we will send them via email to you, because Kim had actually said that he could answer in writing, so he had limited time today to be with us. So there are two questions. I'm going to try and link them so that he can maybe give us just one answer. One had to do with the importance of activism, and it talked about the risks of eco-fascism and this scenario of, we hadn't really talked about that possibility in the Ministry for the Future. You didn't talk about that. So maybe that could be a reflection. And the other question has to do with considering what's the role of art and artists, of trying to find other narratives or other communication codes, and in this crucial moment where we need to communicate the severity of the situation and the urgency of the crisis and the importance of finding alternatives and the policies, the ambitious policies that could maybe be set up.
Sure, thank you. I'll take those in the order that you asked. This term eco-fascism is maybe a science fiction story in disguise, and it might be a kind of an attack on people proposing that we change the laws to avoid a climate crisis. So I distrust it. I'm not sure that the possibility is all that real, that a state using state power would order people to behave in green ways, in ecological ways, nor would it order private capital to, in a way that resembles fascism. So the word itself, fascism, it means two things. There's the historical fascism of the 1930s and 40s and 20s. So we have, in fact, Spain, Italy, Germany, and they're a kind of state-driven capitalism. Now, there is state-driven capitalism in China right now. And indeed, the Chinese citizenry are in many ways very supportive of it, which of course was true in Germany and Italy. So, but no one speaks of China as a fascist state. It's a historical term. And then it's also an insult term. And I guess, could you say that the neoliberal period, 1980 to 2020, when private capital was given the power to make the rules by which the rest of us had to operate, was that a kind of fascism? Well, no, but it was too much power in one part of the political spectrum, which is to say too much power in the hands of private capital, essentially of rich people, operating the world so that in the United States, we called it the 1%. 1% of people were telling the other 99% what to do, and the value of what they did was gathered upward to that 1%. Well, this is unsustainable and quite horrible, and yet it was the way we all lived for 40 years. Now that's falling apart. What comes next? We're not there yet. what the old system has fallen apart, the new system has not yet been invented. One could hope for an eco-socialism, an ecological social democracy as old names for this new system that has not yet been invented. That's what I would hope for myself. And I would say that this is all Gramsci, right? What becomes hegemonic? And so the Italian political theorist Gramsci would have said, the old system has fallen apart, the new one has not yet been born. In the interregnum, you need to think hard about what can come next in a practical legal basis and hope that you can invent the new system in time. In that discussion, I'm not worried about eco-fascism. I don't even understand it as a term, and I distrust it as a kind of an insult against people trying to make state power be ecologically minded. So enough of that, because that, of course, is the deep end of the pool that we're all struggling in together. As for art and artists, well, I think of literature as an art. So again, I'm part of this game. Can you bring the news? And then the visual arts, well, they have such advantages. They are immediate, they slap you in the face. So film and also land art in a country like Spain, with a rich artistic tradition. I guess this is such a cliche, and yet I think it's important. The artist to think of would be Goya, to witness your time in ways that people can't deny anymore, and just to keep on doing it obsessively, maniacally, with the intent to make people see, like you're sticking them in the eyes with daggers of truth. This is what art can do. And so there's an incredibly rich Spanish tradition of drawing, and also a gigantic landscape, a very big country relative to many, with the spaces to do it in. I've read about the emptying villages, everybody going to the big cities on the coast or in Madrid, and these little villages, the young people leaving, the old people dying. Aren't these artworks, or chances for collectives, opportunities, in other words, rather than simply endpoints or failures? They're opportunities also, perhaps. I don't really know. Truthfully, I spent 3 days in Barcelona. That's the entirety of my Spanish experience. So I'm intensely interested in Sevilla, Malaga, in the Balearics, and in the far northwest. But I've never been. So this is all quite hypothetical. And I can just end by saying, in a general sense, the arts are important. They bring the news in ways that are more vivid than just the facts, the statistics, the science, the graphs. It needs to be a needle in the eyeball and a slap in the nose. So that's what art can do. And I certainly have been trying that myself. So yeah, with that, I think I can finish.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kim, for sticking those daggers of truth in our eyes, especially in the case of your literature, because you said that sometimes literature is boring. Well, these are daggers such as the ones that we see with magicians, the ones that don't hurt. It's actually pleasurable. We really enjoy them. So thank you so much. And we would like to say farewell, inviting you to come to Madrid. You know that at La Casa Encendida, we could have some face-to-face events. So that way we could even take you to Mondragon. If you come to see us in Madrid, we will take you to the Basque Country so that you can see the reality there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's been a great pleasure, and I really do hope to see you all in person someday. My wife and I have dreams of travel, and Europe is often super high on our list. So I'll keep my fingers crossed for the health of us and for the world, and hope to meet you all. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a ti, Kim.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Hasta luego, gracias.